Undercover CEO books a room in his own hotel. The receptionist makes a huge mistake. Sometimes, the coldest hearts are hidden behind the warmest smiles. And sometimes, the person you think is beneath you is the one who holds your future in their hands. At a luxury hotel nestled in the heart of Chicago, where chandeliers hang like frozen tears, and every surface sparkles with the polish of pride, a quiet storm was about to erupt, one that would change the lives of everyone. Under its roof, no one noticed. When the quiet older man walked through the lobby that morning, his jacket was wrinkled, his boots dusted with the city's gray snow. To the front desk receptionist, he looked like someone who wandered in off the street. Certainly not someone who belonged among the rich guests who usually filled the suites. She smirked as he approached, already assuming he'd be shooed away after realizing the nightly rates. But what she didn't know was that this man owned the entire building. The chandeliers, the elevators, the walls she leaned against so smugly. He wasn't here to rest. He was here to see who had forgotten the mission. Behind the name engraved on the entrance, Foster Hospitality. What happened next was a lesson in arrogance, humility, and second chances. And it would end with someone learning the hard way that respect is not a courtesy, it's a mirror. Because when the truth was finally revealed, someone who thought they were untouchable ended up standing alone in the cold, literally and metaphorically. This is the story of how one receptionist's pride cost her everything, and how kindness would ultimately triumph. Julian Parks was a man most people would ignore, at least at first glance. 59 years old, graying at the temples, often dressed in simple clothing that betrayed none of his wealth. Julian had mastered the art of staying invisible, but behind that unassuming appearance was a mind as sharp as a scalpel, and a heart that had been both bruised and blessed by the harsh hands of life. Julian hadn't been born into wealth. He was raised by a single mother who cleaned motel rooms to feed him. Growing up, he spent more time in lobbies and laundry rooms than playgrounds, and he never forgot the kindness or the cruelty of the people in those places. He remembered the managers who gave his mother extra food, and the ones who sneered when she brought her son to work. At 17, Julian dropped out of school to help pay bills. He worked every kind of hotel job you can imagine: bellboy, kitchen runner, night janitor, and with every shift, he learned not just the business of hospitality, but the soul of it. How you treat people matters more than how you present yourself. By 40, Julian had opened his own modest inn. By 50, he had acquired a portfolio of elite properties across the country. But the crown jewel was the Foster Regency, his flagship 5-star hotel in Chicago, named in honor of his late mother, Louise Foster. It was meant to represent the values she had taught him: compassion, dignity, and service. But lately, something felt off. Complaints had trickled in, not about the facilities, but about the atmosphere. Guests mentioned coldness, staff turnover was high, and Julian had an uncomfortable suspicion that the place had lost its heartbeat. So, he did something he hadn't done in years. He packed a weekend bag, donned a faded navy coat, scuffed his boots in purpose, and booked a room anonymously, under the name Frank Holloway. No VIP treatment, no suite, just a standard room. He wanted to see for himself how his guests were treated when they didn't look like they mattered. He arrived just before noon, stepping into the lobby through the revolving doors, pausing to take in the grandeur he had built from scratch. The marble floor still gleamed, the chandelier still sparkled, but the warmth was missing. Behind the reception desk stood a young woman with perfect posture, a polished bun, and a face set in stone. Her name tag read, Lexi. She didn't smile when she saw him, just looked him up and down, already deciding who he was. Julian approached with quiet politeness, clutching his reservation confirmation. "Good afternoon. I have a booking under Frank Holloway," he said, his voice soft. Lexi didn't bother hiding it. The way her eyes rolled, just slightly. She tapped at her keyboard, her lips twitching in mild disgust. "Standard room? Sir, just so you're aware, this is a luxury property," she said condescendingly. "We do have some budget chains around the corner that may be more in your price range." Julian blinked, slowly. I believe my card was already charged, he said calmly. Lexi sighed and slid a key card across the marble counter with a single finger. Never meeting his gaze, Julian took it. Without a word, but in his heart, he knew this visit was about to expose more than just poor customer service. It would expose character, and soon, the building's foundation wasn't the only thing that would be shaken. Julian took his key card, nodded a quiet thank you, and walked away. But the sting of Lexi's contempt still lingered in the air, like the faint scent of perfume. Gonsuo. As he rode the elevator to the 4th floor, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror-lined walls. His coat was threadbare, his shirt collars lightly frayed. He had done everything right to appear like just another tired traveler. And still, it was surprising how quickly he'd been dismissed. Room 414 was modest, but elegant. The bed was made with military precision, curtains drawn back to reveal the glittering Chicago skyline. Julian didn't unpack. Instead, he sank into the armchair near the window, quiet, observing, taking it all in. It was time to see his hotel through the eyes of a stranger. The next few hours were telling. The doorman had barely acknowledged him. When he stepped out for a walk around the block, the valet hesitated before handing back his key, as if unsure someone dressed like him even owned a car. But housekeeping was different. A young woman named Rosa smiled warmly as they passed in the hallway. "Good afternoon," she said, genuinely. It was the first sincere greeting he'd received since arriving. Julian took mental notes. Later that evening, he returned to the lobby. The fireplace glowed. Guests mingled in the lounge, glasses of champagne in hand, practiced laughter echoing beneath the chandeliers. Behind the front desk, Lexi was still on duty, tapping at her computer, laughing at something on her phone. Julian approached slowly. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Is there a place nearby where I could grab a simple bite to eat? Something affordable?" Lexi didn't look up at first. When she finally did, her expression was cool. "Impatient. We have a 5-star restaurant downstairs," she said flatly. "But you might want to try the sandwich shop on the corner. It's more your style." A voice from behind cut through the moment. "I think the diner across the street has the best pot roast in the city." Julian turned. A man in his early 30s stood nearby, dressed in a maintenance uniform, with Tom stitched on the chest. His eyes were kind, his smile genuine. Julian nodded. "Thank you, I appreciate that." Lexi gave a forced smile, then muttered, "You're welcome," though it clearly pained her to say it. As Julian walked out, Tom caught up with him. "You're not from around here, huh?" "Just visiting," Julian replied with a smile. "First time staying at this hotel." "Well," Tom said, holding the door open, "hope they treat you right. Some folks here forget what hospitality means." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You don't." Tom shrugged. "I was raised better." Julian chuckled. "That's a good sign." Back in his room later that night, Julian opened a worn leather notebook. He jotted down names, behaviors, impressions. Lexi's name had a long list beneath it. Rosa and Tom had checkmarks of a different kind. The next morning, Julian returned to the lobby and sat quietly in the corner, just watching. He studied the rhythm of his hotel, its pulse, its posture. He noticed Lexi chatting with a wealthy guest, Herr Demiana, completely transformed, smiling, jiggling, as if trying to impress. The switch in her behavior from the night before was stark. With money she was syrupy sweet. Without it, ice. Julian leaned back, folded his arms. This wasn't just poor service. This was a problem of character. And the best way to fix a root problem is to dig deep enough to see it for what it really is. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning brought with it a Chicago chill that bit through wool and bone. Snow dusted the sidewalks like powdered sugar, and the wind lashed against the hotel's glass doors, as if trying to claw its way in. Julian, still under the guise of Frank Halloway, woke early and decided to take a walk before breakfast. Outside, the city was just waking up. Trucks unloaded deliveries. Bundled commuters clutched coffee cups. Steam curled up from sewer grates, like breath from the underworld. Julian turned the corner near the side of the hotel and saw someone familiar. Rosa, the housekeeper who had smiled at him the day before, was kneeling beside an elderly woman on the sidewalk. The woman looked frail, hunched beneath a threadbare blanket, shivering violently. Beside her sat a shopping cart, filled with plastic bags and folded newspapers. Rosa had taken off her coat and draped it around the woman's shoulders. She rubbed her arms gently. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Rosa asked softly. "You need to get somewhere warm." Julian stood across the street, watching, his heart aching at the sight. A moment later, Rosa reached into her pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, folded and worn. She tucked it into the woman's gloved hand. "You go get yourself some hot tea, okay? That diner opens soon. Tell Jose behind the counter I sent you." Julian crossed the street slowly. "Is she all right?" he asked Rosa gently. Rosa looked up startled, then smiled faintly. "She will be. She's here every morning, but today's colder than usual. I couldn't just walk past her." Julian nodded slowly. "That was a kind thing to do." Rosa glanced down. "Kindness doesn't cost much," she said. "And sometimes, it's all someone has left." Julian watched as the woman shuffled off toward the diner. Rosa turned back toward the hotel, her thin sweater barely enough for the bitter wind. Without a word, Julian slipped off his coat and placed it gently over her shoulders. She blinked stunned. "Sir, no, I couldn't." "You can," he said firmly. "And you will." "That's not a request." Tears welled in her eyes. She gave him a grateful nod. Back inside, Julian stepped through the hotel's revolving door. Without a coat, the warmth inside wrapped around him. But he felt something else. A fire beginning to build in his chest. Not anger. Something deeper. Purpose. He passed through the lobby toward the elevator, ignoring Lexi's raised eyebrow, as she spotted him coatless and wind-chapped. An hour later, Julian returned to the front desk, needing to check something about his reservation. Lexi barely looked at him. "I'm busy. Can you wait?" Julian smiled patiently. "Sure." As he waited, Tom, the maintenance worker, walked by carrying a heavy box. He struggled for a moment, the contents wobbling dangerously. Without hesitation, Julian rushed to his side. "Let me help you with that." Tom chuckled. "That's all right, sir, really." "I insist," Julian said, steadying the box and helping carry it to the supply room. They chatted on the way. Julian learned more about Tom's story, how he worked double shifts to support his sister's kids, how he always dreamed of opening a garage of his own one day. When they returned to the lobby, Lexi sneered slightly. "You know you're not staff, right?" she said with a smirk. Julian gave a small smile. "Just lending a hand." Lexi scoffed and turned away, but others had noticed. Rosa, now back on her housekeeping route, wearing Julian's coat, caught his eye. She mouthed, "Thank you." Julian gave a slow nod. This was what the hotel was meant to be. Humanity. Service. Kindness, without condition. Lexi had no idea who he really was, but she had just failed the test that money couldn't buy her way out of. That afternoon, Julian found himself in the hotel's staff break room, an area most guests never saw, tucked behind a nondescript door, labeled "Authorized personnel only." But no one stopped him. Dressed modestly, with no airs about him, he passed as one of them. Tom was sitting at the far end of the room, on a cracked vinyl bench, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag. He waved Julian over without hesitation. "You ever had one of these?" Tom asked, lifting half of his sandwich. "Salami and mustard. It's not gourmet, but it hits the spot." Julian chuckled. "I've eaten worse." He sat down across from him. For the next 30 minutes, they talked like old friends. Tom shared stories about growing up on the South Side, working odd jobs since he was 15, and putting his dreams on hold to raise his sister's kids after she passed away. "They're good kids," Tom said, eyes softening. "One wants to be a nurse, the other, an artist. I just want to give them a chance." Julian listened intently, not out of politeness, but genuine interest. At one point, Tom raised an eyebrow. "You know, you're not like most of the guests we get here." "How so?" Julian asked. "You listen. Most folks in this place, they just want service, without the conversation. Julian smiled faintly. I think everyone has a story worth hearing. Later that day, while walking down the hallway toward his room, Julian ran into Rosa again. She was pushing a cart of fresh towels, her cheeks still flushed from the lingering cold. Still warm in that coat? He asked. She smiled, wrapping it tighter around her. It's like a hug I didn't know I needed. Thank you again, sir. Julian motioned toward the window, where snow was falling again in soft waves. Have you worked here long? 3 years, Rosa replied. I was hired part-time after my husband passed. He was a construction worker, died in an accident, left me with 2 boys. They're teenagers now. Julian's face softened. That must be hard. She nodded. Some days I wonder if I'm doing enough. But I try. I really try. They walked together for a bit, Rosa pointing out things most guests never noticed. The best vending machine, which elevator always sticks, the room where the heat doesn't work quite right. Julian took mental notes of every detail. By now, he'd gathered more insight into his hotel than any quarterly report could ever offer. That evening, Julian returned to the lobby and sat in the lounge. From a quiet corner, he watched the front desk. Lexi was still performing her dual act. Saccharine with the wealthy, bitter with anyone who didn't shine. At one point, an elderly man in worn shoes walked in asking about a cancellation. Lexi dismissed him with a flick of her hand. Didn't even bother to explain. But Rosa noticed. She approached the man gently, offering to help him find something nearby. Tom, too, came out of the maintenance hall, offered to call a cab for him, and Julian watched it all unfold, silently. Later that night, back in the break room, Tom turned to Julian. Mind if I ask you something, Frank? Go ahead. What did you do before you started traveling? Julian paused, then said, I worked my way through the hospitality world. Started from the bottom, just like you. Tom nodded. Figured. You carry yourself like a man who's worked hard. Julian smiled. Still do. And as he left the room, he felt it. Connection. These weren't just employees. They were the heart of his hotel. And he was ready to protect that heart, no matter what it took. 2 days had passed since Julian checked into his own hotel, under a false name, and while the chandeliers still glistened, and the piano music drifted softly through the lobby, he now saw past the facade. Behind the polished counters and velvet drapes were cracks. Cracks caused not by time, but by arrogance, and the sharpest crack was named Lexi. That morning, as Julian sat quietly in the lounge, sipping a modest cup of coffee, a sudden commotion stirred at the front desk. He looked up. Lexi stood scowling at Rosa, her arms crossed tightly. I don't care what your excuse is, Lexi snapped, loud enough for guests nearby to hear. You left the guest towels in the wrong room. And Mr. Hargrove complained. That reflects on me. Rosa stood still, clutching a stack of fresh linens, her face pale. I apologized to him personally, Rosa said softly. I made sure he had everything within 10 minutes. Lexi cut her off. But it shouldn't have happened in the first place. Honestly, Rosa, if you can't handle simple tasks, maybe you're not suited for a place of this standard. Julian rose from his seat, slowly watching. Rosa's hands trembled. I can handle it, she whispered. My son was sick this morning. I barely made it here in time, but I still came in. Lexi rolled her eyes. Oh, spare me the sob stories, she said, voice cold. This is a luxury establishment, not a charity. Rosa turned away, blinking back tears, her shoulders heavy with shame. Julian's jaw tightened. He wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet, but his silence now would be complicity. A few moments later, Tom stepped out from a side hallway, wiping his hands on a rag. He caught sight of Rosa's face, red, trembling. What happened? He asked. She shook her head. Just Lexi, again? She said I'm not suited for this place. Tom scoffed. Lexi thinks a job title makes someone better. She forgets. The best people are the ones who remember where they came from. Nearby, Julian gave Tom a brief nod. A quiet agreement. Later that day, things only escalated. Julian had requested a wake-up call. It never came. When he politely mentioned it to Lexi, she narrowed her eyes. I didn't see a request in the system, she said curtly. I left it with the desk last night. Perhaps you imagined it, she added, with a fake smile. Or maybe next time, you should just use the alarm on your phone. Other guests turned, taken aback by her tone. Julien didn't argue. He simply said, "Thank you," and walked away. But inside, he knew, the final line had just been crossed. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior. This was habitual disrespect. A pattern built on entitlement, an unchecked ego. Lexi had created a two-tier world in that lobby, one for those with status, and another for everyone else. And people like Rosa and Tom were bearing the weight of it. That evening, as Rosa gathered trash bags from guest rooms, and Tom fixed a flickering light on the third floor, Julien sat at the edge of his bed, notebook open, pen steady. He wrote everything, every moment of cruelty, every act of kindness, every time someone showed up, when it would have been easier to walk away. And under Lexi's name, he underlined one word: unfit. Tomorrow, the charade would end. But he wouldn't just reveal himself. He would make sure every person in that hotel saw what happens when you treat others like they don't matter. And some would rise, while others would fall. It was Monday morning, and the grand lobby of the Foster Regency shimmered in gold and marble, as usual. But today, something was different. The entire staff had been summoned for a mandatory meeting. Most assumed it was another policy update, maybe a guest protocol reminder. Lexi, however, walked into the main conference hall with a proud sway in her step, clearly expecting to be recognized, maybe even promoted. She'd spent the morning adjusting her hair, her makeup, even spritzed a little of her expensive perfume, the kind she only wore for important eyes. Rumor had it, someone from corporate was visiting. She assumed naturally they'd want her front and center. Employees trickled in, one by one. Rosa, in her slightly oversized coat. Tom, with grease still on his sleeves. Kitchen staff in aprons. Housekeeping still in motion. Most sat quietly, uncertain why they'd been called together. Then the double doors opened, and in walked the same older man Lexi had been brushing off for days. Julien Parks, still dressed plainly, still humble in posture, but now walking with a purpose that filled the room like thunder before a storm. Lexi's face twisted in confusion. Is he lost? Tom stood up slowly, eyes widening. Rosa dropped the notepad she'd been nervously holding. Julien walked to the front of the room. He turned toward the staff and spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but clear. "My name is Julien Parks. Some of you may know me better as the man behind Foster Hospitality." Gasps echoed through the room. Lexi went pale. Julien continued. "This hotel was built in honor of my mother, Louise Foster. She believed in dignity, in hard work, and above all, in treating every human being with kindness." He looked around, letting the words settle. "Over the past few days, I've stayed here undercover to see if this place still lives up to her legacy." Lexi shifted, uncomfortable, her mouth slightly open. "No words yet. And what I found," Julien said slowly, "was eye-opening." He pulled out a small notebook, opened it. "I encountered staff who gave from their hearts, who offered warmth, even when they had so little themselves. Rosa, who gave her coat to a freezing woman on the sidewalk. Tom, who never hesitated to help a stranger or speak kindly when no one was watching." Rosa covered her mouth with both hands. Tom blinked hot, looked down at his shoes. "But I also saw something else," Julien continued, his tone hardening. "I saw arrogance at the front desk. I saw condescension, cruelty, and a complete lack of the values this hotel was founded on." He turned, slowly. "Lexi." She flinched, as if struck by the air itself. "You dismissed guests based on their appearance. You belittled your coworkers. And you treated this hotel like a stage, not a sanctuary." "Too, didn't know," she stammered. "That's the point," Julien said sharply. "You only showed kindness when you thought someone could give you something." The room was silent. No one moved. Julien took a breath, then looked toward Rosa and Tom. "These are the people who define what hospitality means. People like them are the reason guests feel seen, valued, safe." He turned back to the staff. As of today, there will be changes. Real ones. We will reward those who carry this hotel on their backs, often without thanks. And we will no longer tolerate behavior that stains the values we claim to uphold. Then he looked Lexi in the eyes. You're relieved of your position. Effective immediately. Lexi gasped. Her voice cracked. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, Julian said. And I suggest you take this as a lesson. In life, and especially in hospitality, you should never assume the worth of a person by the coat they wear, or the card they use to check in. Lexi stood frozen, as the reality hit her harder than any snowstorm ever could. She had been so busy, trying to impress the powerful, she didn't realize one of them had been standing right in front of her the entire time, and now, she was out in the cold. The conference room remained silent, as Lexi, faced and trembling, stormed out. Without another word, no one followed her. No one offered sympathy. She had burned too many bridges, with cold words and colder eyes. Julian turned back to the remaining staff, his expression now softer, calmer, but no less certain. I know many of you have been working under pressure, without proper recognition, or even basic appreciation. He paused. That ends today. He motioned toward Rosa. She hesitated, eyes darting to Tom. He gave a gentle nod, still clutching the coat Julian had given her days ago. She stepped forward, her eyes full of disbelief. Rosa, Julian began. You remind me of my mother. She was a housekeeper too. I watched her work herself to the bone, never asking for anything, but always giving everything. Rosa's lips quivered. You've shown more grace and humanity in 3 days than some people do in a lifetime. And I'm not just thanking you with words. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, handed it to her. Inside, a formal offer letter. Executive housekeeping supervisor. A salaried position. Full benefits. Paid time off. A pay grade she had only ever dreamed of. Rosa's knees nearly gave out. I don't know what to say, she whispered, voice cracking. Julian smiled warmly. Say yes. She threw her arms around him, tears spilling freely. The room exhaled with her. Then Julian turned to Tom. Tom, he said, you've been holding this place together? More than anyone knows. You could have turned bitter. God knows you've had reason. But you didn't. You chose kindness. Integrity. Tom scratched the back of his neck, clearly overwhelmed. You told me once you wanted to open your own garage. Tom blinked. He did. Still do. Well, Julian said, today you're one step closer. We're setting up a grant under your name, fully funded by Foster Hospitality. You'll have access to mentorship, startup capital, everything you need to build that dream. In the meantime, Julian smiled. You're being promoted to facilities director, with a team under you, and a significant raise. Tom's mouth fell open. You're kidding. Julian shook his head. Not even close. Tom stood in stunned silence. Then, he pulled Julian into a tight, emotional hug. Thank you. I don't know how. Thank you. You earned it, Julian said firmly. Every bit of it. He turned back to the group. From now on, he said, voice steady, every staff member here will be trained, not just in etiquette, but in empathy. Promotions will be based on heart, not just polish. And no more silencing voices. If someone is mistreated, I want to know. Heads nodded, eyes lit up, spirits lifted. And to every employee here today, who's shown up on time, stayed late, helped without being asked, your bonuses are being doubled this quarter, effective immediately. For the first time in a long time, applause erupted. Not the stiff, obligated kind, but the kind that comes from people who had waited so long to be seen. Julian stepped back, overwhelmed by his own emotion. His mother would have been proud. Later that evening, the atmosphere in the hotel had changed completely. The tension was gone, replaced with laughter, energy, life. Rosa walked through the lobby, not with her head down, but held high. Guests smiled at her. Staff greeted her with a new title, boss. Tom passed her on the way to the elevator, toolbox in one hand, promotion letter in the other. Guess we're moving up, he said with a grin. She smiled back, tears shining in her eyes. Feels like we finally matter. Julian stood by the fireplace, quietly watching. No speech, no spotlight, just watching, as his hotel finally began to breathe again. The Foster Regency had its heartbeat back, and this time, it was louder than ever. 6 months later, the Foster Regency looked the same on the outside. Grand arches, velvet drap, and a golden logo polished daily. But step inside, and something fundamental had changed. There was a warmth now, not from the lobby's fireplace, but from the people. Guests were greeted with real smiles, not rehearsed ones. The staff moved like a team, respectful, energized, proud. And at the center of it all stood Rosa, no longer the quiet housekeeper in the shadows. Now, she led her department, with calm authority, and a tailored blazer that fit not just her frame, but her presence. She walked like someone who finally understood her worth. Her sons had visited the hotel just last week. One had been accepted into an arts scholarship program, the other helping her study for her GED. Pride ran in both directions now. Tom? His garage was already under renovation. The sign above the soon-to-open shop would read, Tom's Honest Repairs. Julian had been his first investor. But Tom earned every nail, every bolt, every screw, through sweat and soul. And Julian? He quietly returned to his corporate role. But he visited the Foster Regency often, sometimes announced, sometimes not. Not to inspect, to reconnect. The staff didn't fear him anymore. They looked forward to seeing him. They called him Mr. Parks, out of respect, not obligation. And Lexi? Word had it, she bounced around a few hotels. Never stayed long. Some lesson, freeze deeper than winter. Because true hospitality isn't about chandeliers or stars on a review site. It's about people, about dignity, about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. Because whether you're behind the desk or checking in for the night, how you treat others always comes back around. And sometimes, it comes back, wearing a name tag, with more power than you ever imagined.